to Lecture 6 of Ecology. In the last lecture, we covered some refresher information on evolution, natural selection, adaptation, and the mechanisms that fuel adaptations. Today, we're going to talk about some specific examples of how plants have adapted to deal with changing environments. And of course, I have on my favorite plant dress for this lecture, and I brought some, well, they're not plant friends, but some of my favorite plant examples. This is a sugar pine cone. Yes, it is a real pine cone. I know, it's gigantic. And then this is a coulter pine cone. I'm having trouble holding it because it is very spiky. I found both of these doing field work in California. Yes, they are real pine cones. This is from a coulter pine. It's very spiky and kind of hard to hold. And they grow in Southern California. This is from a sugar pine that grow up in the Sierra Nevada. And these are two really, really cool plant adaptations. So let's talk a little more about how plants adapt to different environments. Okay, let's talk about plant adaptations to the environment. First, I want to do a little review of photosynthesis. Hopefully, you remember this from Gen Bio. Maybe you don't. It's maybe been a while. Let's do a little review. Photosynthesis is the primary way that energy enters into ecological systems, and so it's really important to at least know the basics in the main primary function of it. So it's the conversion of carbon dioxide into simple sugars. That simple sugar is then used to fuel all sorts of biological processes. And it's, like I said, the primary way that energy is going to enter into an ecological system. Autotrophs are really important in ecological systems and food webs, and we'll talk all about them. So solar radiation generates ATP and NADPH, which are needed to synthesize G3P and rubisco. These are just some. I'm not going to ask you to detail all of the reactions involved in photosynthesis. Just know the basics. Carbon dioxide is also used in the Calvin cycle and is also released during cellular respiration. An important thing to know is that net photosynthesis, the net amount of energy that is produced from photosynthesis, is going to be what's produced via photosynthesis minus what's lost from respiration. That's net photosynthesis. Now, the light that a plant is receiving from the sun is going to affect its photosynthetic activity. And as we already talked about in the climate lecture, the available photosynthetically active radiation is going to vary based on environments, where they are on the globe, on lots of different things. So, like I said, the availability of light is going to directly influence the rate of photosynthesis. And at night, only respiration occurs, and then the net uptake of carbon dioxide is negative. The light compensation point is when the rate of net photosynthesis is 0. So there's enough light for photosynthesis to be taking in as much CO2 as respiration is losing. That's the light compensation point. And this is going to vary for different species of plants based on the environments in which they've evolved in. So that's the light compensation point. Now, the light saturation point are the limits at which photosynthesis can operate. So there is a limit at which each individual plant is going to be based on its amount of chlorophyll. It's going to be based on the environment that it's in. It's going to be based on the amount of PAR that it's receiving. That's the light saturation point. At that light saturation point, that's when photosynthesis starts to plateau. That's the maximum rate of net photosynthesis. That's as much as it can do. And as you know, photoinhibition is called the negative effect of light. So photoinhibition is a negative effect of light on plants. And photorespiration can happen when you hit this light saturation point and can actually negatively affect photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, as hopefully you already know, involves exchanges between the plant and the atmosphere. So the climate of the environment is heavily going to dictate the types of plant species that can grow in it. Also, hopefully review, photosynthesis occurs in mesophyll cells in terrestrial plants. We're going to talk about how aquatic plants deal with environments. And carbon dioxide enters leaves through stomata via diffusion. Those are stomata there. They're basically holes in plant leaves. And as long as photosynthesis keeps working, there's always going to be less CO2 inside the leaves. You know that sometimes you can get photorespiration at night, and you end up with more carbon dioxide in the leaves, and that's when you get photorespiration. Again, review from Gen Bio 2. When photosynthesis starts slowing down, the stomata are going to close, and this will keep water from diffusing out of the plant. So stomata in themselves are really cool plant adaptations to deal with water availability and carbon dioxide availability in the environment. Stomata themselves, which plants have. Maybe you remember what water loss through the stomata is called from the climate lecture when we were talking about water availability in the environment. That's transpiration. Soil is a really important component of environments. So let's talk about some physiological properties of plants that are going to be dictated by the soil. So water moves from the soil through the plant to the atmosphere. And water that's lost to the atmosphere is then regained to retain turgor pressure. So turgor pressure is the pressure of the water inside the plant that helps it maintain stability. If a plant has bark, that also provides stability, but not all plants have bark, and so they rely a lot on turgor pressure from the water that they obtain from the soil. Water gets into the plant through passive transport. Some other key terms to know: osmotic potential is determined by the concentration of solutes inside and outside of the cell. So soil chemistry, and which is dictated by what we talked about earlier when we were talking about climate. Soil chemistry is dictated partly by bedrock, partly by human activities. Soil chemistry is going to be really important for determining the osmotic potential of the soil, which is then going to affect the plants that can live in it. Matrix potential of soil is also going to dictate the types of plants that can live in it. This is basically the tendency of water to adhere to surfaces. So how much water can soil hold? It's going to be influenced a lot by its texture. So clays have a more negative matrix potential than sandy soil, so matrix potential is influenced a lot by texture and how much moisture it can hold. And the rate of water loss is going to vary, obviously, with environmental conditions. Near the equator, there's higher rainfall, higher temperatures. Near the poles, you have, depending on the seasons, less rainfall, less sunlight. And all those environmental conditions are going to vary the amount of water available in the environment, and those are going to affect the plants. So a balance between the amount of photosynthesis that a plant is able to do and how much it respires are going to shape that plant's evolution. And photosynthesis and respiration are going to be directly affected by climatic conditions. Now, how aquatic and terrestrial autotrophs, mostly plants, uptake carbon is going to differ based on their environment. Obviously, in aquatic environments, this also includes cyanobacteria and other phytoplankton. But mostly we're talking about plants here. Aquatic autotrophs, like this aquatic plant here, you can actually see, we will go and look at some aquatic autotrophs in lab at Palmer Pond, because there's a lot in there right now. We'll go look at some. Aquatic autotrophs do not have stomata. Carbon dioxide is going to diffuse directly from the water through the cell membranes. So stomata are unique adaptation in terrestrial plants to living on land and having to deal with water availability. Photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis, the reactions is going to be similar in both aquatic and terrestrial autotrophs. Some aquatic species can use bicarbonate as a carbon dioxide source, so they use carbonic anhydrase. They use this enzyme to convert it to carbon dioxide within their cells, or sometimes they'll release it into the water. So sometimes they'll actually release bicarbonate around the water they'll release carbonic anhydrase into the water to break down bicarbonate, make it into usable carbon dioxide. Aquatic autotrophs don't need stomata because they're surrounded by water, so they don't have to deal with water loss so much, but they do have to deal sometimes with a lack of carbon dioxide, especially if that water is not well aerated. So examples of CO2 poor waters would be wetlands, for instance, and other things that don't have a lot of turbation to mix in gases into the water. So the organisms that live in there have to adjust their photosynthetic rates and may even grow slower because they have less available carbon dioxide. Now, the temperature of the plant, which is going to be directly affected by the climate and by sunlight availability, are going to reflect the temperature of the plant is going to reflect their energy balance with the surrounding environment. Photosynthesis and respiration are enzymatic reactions, and so they're both going to respond to temperature. As temperature rises, photosynthesis rates are going to increase above respiration, but photosynthesis also has a temperature limit. So it has a light availability, light radiation limit, and temperature and light radiation are linked to each other, so that makes sense. There is a minimum and a maximum temperature where net photosynthesis is 0, and that's going to vary depending on the plant species. The temperature of the leaf is going to control rates of photosynthesis and respiration. So some plants have evolved specific leaf shapes to maximize their photosynthetic potential in certain environments. We'll talk about that in just a second. Terrestrial plants are going to release heat through evaporation and convection, and aquatic plants mostly release heat through convection. What's convection? Convection is movement caused within a fluid by the tendency of hotter and less dense material to rise. So hot stuff is less dense, so it rises to the surface. Colder, denser material sinks to the bottom. We talked about this when we were talking about seasonality changes. So in environments when they start to cool right before winter, you see a lot more nutrient cycling in ponds and in lakes and things like that because of convection, the tendency of hotter, less dense material to rise and colder, denser material to sink. So a lot of terrestrial plants and aquatic plants are going to release heat through convection. Leaf size and shape are going to influence the ability of the plant to exchange heat. I already talked about that already, and we'll go into a little more detail in just a second. And in human environments, cooling mostly happens through transpiration. So plants will transpire sometimes to cool down their surfaces, because if they get too hot, it will interfere with the enzymatic reactions involved in photosynthesis. In dry climates, leaf sizes tend to be smaller, and that promotes more convection. So, the physical environment and the climate that is encountered in different physical environments has played a huge role in shaping plant adaptations. These are just some desert adaptations that I think are really cool and we're going to talk about. In dry and sunny environments, like the desert, you have high temperatures and low humidity, and so you tend to also have smaller leaves and an increase in the production of roots, because the strongest limiting factor in the environment is going to be water availability, and so a lot of desert adapted species have these special adaptations for obtaining water in water poor environments. So One example is xerophyte. These plants, their strategy is to deal with a lack of water availability by storing as much of the little water made available. So they store it, and then they reduce their evapotranspiration rate. So that's the cactus is a great example of a xerophyte. Now you have, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, phreatophytes, which are different desert adapted species. These are plants that are also adapted to water availability, but they have a different strategy. So what they do is they grow extremely long roots. So instead of storing the water made available to them, they dig down deep into the soil so that they can hit groundwater, and that allows them to obtain water straight from the water table. So ocotillo, which is a really cool plant, is an example of a phreatophyte. So let's see some pictures of these cool guys. This is one of my favorite cacti. If you've ever been to Arizona, there's lots of these. This is a saguaro cactus. So cacti, for example, are xerophytes. And then this is an ocotillo. This is a picture I took of an ocotillo out at Anza-Borrego Desert in Southern California. And these are that's my lab meat from when I was working out in California. This is an ocotillo bush. These are the ones that have these really deep roots that tap into the water table. Those are the phreatophytes. So some examples of these plant adaptations, they might have more leaves and stems, which leads to more access to light and CO2, but less root mass. So if you have smaller root mass, you see this really commonly in plants in very humid environments where water is not a limiting factor. If you have more roots, you have more access to water and soil nutrients, which is important if you're water limited, like the desert environments that the saguaro and the ocotillo grow in. But they have less leaf and stem mass. Saguaro is actually kind of an exception. That's kind of quite a lot of leaf mass for a plant, but it's storing a lot of water inside of this tissue. And even though it has really large roots to support this really large structure, it's storing a lot of water in this tissue. These, for instance, have huge root masses, but they don't store a lot in the above ground mass. Neither of these plants do well in wet or cold climates. If any of you have tried to grow a cactus in your house, you might have maybe overwatered it, and they have a tendency to rot if you try to grow them in wet or cold climates because they're just not adapted to dealing with high water availability. There are lots of special plant adaptations to differences in light availability as well. I talked a little bit about that when I was talking about doing research in Arctic regions where there's spring and summer lasts about 3 months, and 9 months out of the year it's completely freezing and covered in snow. You can have shade intolerant and shade tolerant species. Species that are shade intolerant have adapted to high light sun environments, and so they have high photosynthetic rates, and they need a lot of PAR to be able to photosynthesize at a rate that can support their growth. On the other hand, there are shade tolerant species. These are species that have evolved in low light environments. If you guys have done any sort of like landscaping, you'll know some of these species. A lot of prairie plants, so like milkweed, and what else I have growing in my front yard? Butterfly weed. A lot of the stuff I have growing in my front yard that are native prairie plants, they're shade intolerant because they grow in environments with not a lot of trees, and so they need high light, full sun. If you've ever seen a plant that says it's full sun, that's a shade intolerant species. And there are other species that if they get too much sunlight, then they will hit their maximum rate of photosynthesis. They'll start doing photorespiration, and that will negatively impact their growth. So, and a lot of times, if you grow like a shade tolerant species, and you give it too much light, you'll start to see scorch lines around the lines because they've had too much sunlight. A lot of houseplants or plants that people keep in their offices tend to be shade tolerant because they don't get a ton of sunlight. ZZ plants are a great example. Maddie Kornman just asked me about good house plants for low light availability. ZZ plants are perfect. They're shade tolerant. So I'm going to go over what happens when they get too much sun in shade tolerant species, just as to go over it again. So they have lower light saturation points. They have a lower maximum rate of photosynthesis, like I said. They probably also don't make as much chlorophyll as some of the shade intolerant species. They have lower concentrations of rubisco because of the low light. Oh, but some of them will have high concentrations of chlorophyll. So actually, sorry, I misspoke. So they'll have low concentrations of rubisco, but they'll have high concentrations of chlorophyll because they want to, they are adapted to low light environments. And so the more chlorophyll they have, the more likely they are to obtain that light radiation when it's available in the environment. So if their rate of photosynthesis is lower, the rate of respiration is going to be lower, and so they'll have a slower growth rate. Like I said before, some plants have evolved differences in leaf shape to maximize or minimize their exposure to light in the environment depending on where they evolved. Specific leaf area is the surface area of a leaf produced per gram of biomass allocated to the production of leaves. And shade-tolerant species usually have a higher SLA and a thinner leaf thickness. So if you're growing in the shade, you want to maximize your, you don't get a lot of sunlight, but you want to be able to absorb as much sunlight as comes into that environment. So like I said, they'll have higher chlorophyll content, and they also might have higher SLA. So they'll have broad, wide leaves that increase their surface area that is exposed to sunlight when they get sunlight. Some trees will actually change their shape, particularly trees that are very tall and will have a canopy and an understory. On the individual trees, they'll have differences in leaf shape. So the ones that are lower on the tree have a higher SLA and thinner leaf thickness, and the ones at the top that are closer to the sun, don't have to deal so much with light availability, might be thicker and not nearly as broad and have a lower SLA. So that's on an individual tree. Sometimes you can see differences in leaf shape to deal with light availability. And that's phenotypic plasticity. So if it's an individual plant that's changing its individual leaves in response to light availability, that's plant phenotypic plasticity. Let's talk about some more plant adaptations to water and temperature. The air temperature is going to be directly related to transpiration that is going on in the plant. So climate can also be affected by the plant species that live in it. It's all a whole cycle. Stomata will open and close, as you know, based on turgor pressure, depending on soil moisture and water content in the atmosphere. And all of these, so stomata opening and closing, leaf curling and wilting, these are all examples of phenotypic plasticity, but not developmental plasticity, because they can switch back and forth to their leaves curling or wilting. So stomata opening and closing and leaf curling and wilting is an example of acclimation. So just as a refresher from the last lecture, developmental plasticity and acclimation are both types of phenotypic plasticity. Acclimation is when an individual organism can switch back and forth between phenotypes. Developmental plasticity is when a change happens in an individual organism early in development, but once it becomes an adult, it can't switch back and forth. So leaf curling and wilting and stomata opening and closing are examples of adaptation. This here, I've been meaning to get one for the biology department. This is a resurrection plant that can basically live in this dormant, dry state for years and decades until it receives water. And then when it receives water, it will exit out of this dormant state and basically turn into a live plant, which is why they call it a resurrection plant. That's acclimation. Developmental plasticity, some examples of how plants are developmentally plastic is that they can they can alter their root structure and stem growth and leaf area to match the moisture content. So something I've been doing with plants I've been growing inside my house in under grow lights in my basement, and then transplanting them outside, I kind of made a big mistake early on where I grew them inside and then I immediately planted them in the soil outside. But they didn't have much time to adapt to an outside environment, particularly wind. And so what I realized is what I need to do is take them in their pots outside, expose them to environment, to the wind, to the differences in solar radiation, allow them to grow thicker stems, and to adapt to that, and then plant them in the soil. So they, that's an example of like horticultural developmental plasticity and how horticulturalists grow plants so that they can exhibit developmental plasticity and last longer in the environment when they're transplanted. So now let's talk about C4 and C3 plants. Hopefully this is all review from Gen Bio as well. C3 plants, they capture light and carbon and do carbon fixation. Both of those activities happen in the mesophyll cells. In C4 plants, mesophyll cells and bundle sheath cells both photosynthesize. Diagram here. The C4 photosynthetic pathway is going to lead to decreased rates of net photosynthesis, and then CO2 concentrations in bundle sheath cells can be much higher than in the mesophyll cells or in the atmosphere, and because of that, generally they're going to have a higher maximum rate of photosynthesis in C4 plants. Corn's a perfect example of that. C4 plants are also, because of this cellular morphology and physiology, they have greater water use efficiency in the environment, so they're found in warmer and drier climates typically. So C4 photosynthesis is an adaptation to warmer and drier climates. There's also the CAM pathway, which should also be reviewed from Gen Bio. It's similar to the C4 pathway, but there's no bundle sheath cells. CAM pathway plants open their stomata at night, and then during that time they convert carbon dioxide to malic acid. So they're basically turning malic acid into a shuttle for carbon dioxide in the mesophyll cells, and then they close their stomata and reconvert malic acid into carbon dioxide, which is then fixed by the C3 cycle. I think there's a close their stomata at night. Oh, no. Sorry. There's a typo here. So their stomata are open at night and closed during the day. Sorry, that's a typo there. Anyway. The CAM pathway is pretty slow and inefficient at carbon dioxide fixation, but it has evolved in desert-adapted species because it reduces the water loss by only opening the stomata at night. Let's go back to the saguaro and ocotillo. Both of these plants, they're going to have smaller and less stomata. The saguaro, not necessarily. It does have pretty thick roots to support this, but the ocotillo for sure has more root biomass, and it also has smaller leaf area. So if you look at this picture here, they've got very, very small, tiny leaves. And that has mostly to do with water availability. The bigger the leaf, the more water you need in the environment, and the more water that's going to be lost to the environment, so that's why a lot of desert-adapted species tend to have very small leaves. Another plant adaptation to water and temperature availability is winter deciduous trees, which you can hopefully we'll see around here in Pennsylvania. I don't know if we've had enough cool days yet. Winter deciduous trees shed their leaves before the cold season, and that's because during the cold season there's less light availability, and there's less of an opportunity for the leaves to be photosynthesizing, and so instead of photosynthesizing, they enter kind of a dormant state. They shed their leaves and they enter a dormant state during which that time temperature and water and light availability is lower. And then when light availability increases and temperature increases, they'll grow back their leaves and photosynthesize again. Another really cool adaptation, which was unique to those huge pine cones I just showed you, are coniferous trees. In their needles, they actually produce protective compounds that are going to protect needles and leaves from freezing. So evergreens, plants that are considered evergreen and they keep their leaves even during the winter when there's less light availability and lower temperatures, they produce compounds in their leaves that protect them from freezing damage. Those compounds, when they do shed their needles and they decay in the soil, they release those compounds that specifically protect them from freezing, are what makes soils acidic when they shed those leaves, which we talked about previously when we talked about soil and podzolization. Now we're going to talk about my favorite adaptation, plant adaptation in the whole world, and that is bristlecone pines. Bristlecone pines, if you have not heard of them, they are some of the oldest organisms on the planet. This is a picture I took in the bristlecone pine forest in Inyo National Forest in California. If you ever have the chance to go, you absolutely should, because it is like one of the most ancient places on the face of the planet. Bristlecone pines now I can't remember the oldest aged one. I think it's 6,500 years old is the oldest tree. And I think its name is Methuselah. That's in the bristlecone pine forest. These things have lived so long because they have extreme adaptations to nutrient availability. One thing is that they grow extremely slowly. They do not need a lot of nutrients because they have extremely low growth rates. They live in deserty, sandy soils that are low in macronutrients and micronutrients. Like I said, they have really low rates of photosynthesis and growth, lower demand for nutrients, which are very limited in this soil. And because of that, the plants can avoid stress during extreme conditions. They can basically enter into a semi-dormant state when conditions are not favorable. Bristlecone pines that have grown in the bristlecone forest, which is windy and dry and hot, have almost no leaves on them. I think this is a separate tree. This is also a bristlecone pine, but this is a tree that's been there a long time, and it's very gnarled and mangly. They are very thick because they're dealing with high wind, and so they exhibit developmental plasticity, and their trunks are thicker, and they don't invest a lot in leaf area because of the lack of water availability in the environment. Now, if you were to take a seed from this tree and grow it in like the soil in Pennsylvania, this what it's going to look like, just like your basic evergreen tree, because it will have less wind, more nutrient availability, and it'll have higher growth rates, and it'll invest more in leaf area because it has higher nutrient and water availability. So it just looks like a basic pine tree when it grows in high nutrient environments. It only looks cool and hardened when it grows with a really low lack of nutrients. They are so cool. You guys have to go see them. They're the coolest organisms on the planet. And because they are so cool, I spent a lot of time last year photoshopping a bunch of them into a scene from Mad Max Fury Road, which I guess now is an antiquated reference because that movie's kind of old now. But they are like one of the most badass organisms on the planet. And I made this picture to reflect that. So, let's end on a cool note with bristlecone pines. And next time, we'll talk about cool animal adaptations to extreme environments. Okay, bye-bye!